Reverend Haney.
Oh, that's fine. How you doing, Tom? Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Reverend Haney. Thank you so much for inviting me on your program.
I'm so glad to have you. I'm excited to talk about this book. It's always the American dream is kind of, I think, the heart of the election right now, right? Is how do we get back to that dream? So I'm glad we can talk about what you did here.
It seems so. Yeah, it's a pretty important issue, actually.
It is. I love to ask my guests this question, get a chance to know you a little bit better. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
My father, for years, used to say, if you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything at all." And while I haven't always kept to that, every time I've deviated from it, I've learned anew how wise it was. I think that's probably the best one.
That's a good one because if we could follow that model today in society, life would be so much easier.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm curious, what inspired you to write the book, The History of the American Dream? It's a fascinating title.
Well, the American dream is a kind of intrinsic to the American myth. All the way from the founding to today. The idea that people can just kind of strike out on their own and make it. People can rise to whatever their potential is. Um, uh, we've gone through periods of time where it's easier and harder, and where different groups of people have been blocked out from that. Particularly people of color and women, but nonetheless, it's always been kind of this animating thing, at the core. I mean, de Tocqueville wrote about it at some length in 1834 in Democracy in America. And so the American dream in the 20th century and now in the 21st century has largely been tied into this idea of the American middle class. And the American middle class has gone through a whole series of changes. There was a fairly substantial middle class. It wasn't half of Americans, but it was a meaningful middle class at the founding of the Republic, mostly because land was so cheap because it was being stolen from the Indians left and right. And so, you had all these subsistence farms, which were arguably middle class people. They weren't desperate. They even though they didn't have a lot of money, they were able to, make their way. And then that kind of started to evaporate in the 1830s. And from the 1830s until really the 1890s, most Americans just got very poor. And then with the industrialization of America, you had these attempts to overcome that poverty through things like the union movement. And finally, America had enough. In 1891, we passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up the big corporations. In 1905, Teddy Roosevelt came along and put into place the inheritance tax and started actually enforcing the Sherman Act. And but then in the 1920s, during the Roaring '20s, we really had a collapse of the middle class. The Roaring '20s was a period of time when the rich got really rich, and average working people were just devastated, and police were literally murdering union leaders and things like that. And so in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt came into office and said, "I'm going to create a middle class." Capitalism doesn't normally create a middle class. If you want to see what happens with unregulated capitalism, this isn't a hit on capitalism. I'm a fan of it. But if you want to see what happens with unregulated capitalism, read any book by Charles Dickens. That's the world that, and you can look at 7,000 years of history to see this. That's the world that unregulated capitalism creates. You have a small, very, very wealthy top 1%. In Dickens' books, it's the royal families and their friends. You have a small middle class, 3 or 4% of the population, who are the doctors, the lawyers, and the business owners. Like in Dickens' Christmas Carol book, Ebenezer Scrooge, he owned a small business with one employee. It's about as small as a business can get. He was the middle class. And then below that, you've got the 95% who are the working poor. And in fact, England thought that this was, for centuries, thought that this was the best way to ensure social stability. So right up until the mid 1800s, England had maximum wage laws where it was against the law for an employer to pay somebody more than a certain amount, or you'd violate the law in order to prevent a middle class from emerging. So Franklin Roosevelt came along and said, "I'm going to create the world's first middle class that's more than half the population of a country." And he did that by adding things to capitalism, by adding Social Security, adding a minimum wage, adding unemployment insurance, adding the legal right to unionize and negotiate your contracts, and a whole variety of things. I mean, there's a whole collection of them that basically literally created the American middle class. Well, by 1950, the middle class was starting to hit almost 50% of all Americans. And so in 1951, this guy named Russell Kirk, a major conservative thinker, wrote a book called The Conservative Mind from Eliot to Burke. And in it, he quoted at length, from Burke to Eliot, Edmund Burke, who was a famous British economist and philosopher around the time of the American Revolution. Burke said that, basically, if your middle class ever gets too large, you're going to sow social chaos. And so what Kirk said, kind of quoting Burke, only in the version of 1951, was that if the American middle class ever got too large, and he wasn't sure what that number would be, but he was pretty sure we were damn close to it. If it ever got too large, you'd have a complete societal breakdown. And he identified a couple things. He said women would no longer know their place in the family. He said young people would start to defy their elders and go in ways that, are ahistoric. And he said that minorities would no longer, quote, know their place in society. So, in 51, when he wrote this book, it was a kind of a splash in the conservative circles, and Barry Goldwater and William F. Buckley got all excited about it. But most people thought he was a crank until the 60s. In 1961, the birth control pill was legalized by the FDA. And so by 65, you had a major women's movement going on, women saying, hey, we can control our reproduction. We want access to the workplace. In 65, you had the beginnings of the Vietnam War, and by 66, 67, 68, you had a major anti-war movement. And throughout the 60s, you had, it's arguably the peak of the civil rights movement with, Dr. King and ultimately the assassination of Dr. King. And so toward the late 60s, when you had cities on fire, you had young men saying, burning draft cards, you had women burning bras and saying, hell no. At that point, a lot of Republicans looked back on Russell Kirk's writings and what Goldwater and Buckley had been saying for years and said, holy crap, these people were right. And we got to do something about this middle class, because if it gets any bigger, America is going to just dissolve into anarchy. And so when Reagan came into office in 1981, his mandate from the conservative thinkers of the day, and they were fairly explicit about this, at that point in time, the middle class was 2/3 of us. A third of us had a good union job, which set the wage floor for another third of us, who didn't have union jobs, but had, our employers had to compete with union jobs. And so 2/3 of Americans were living that middle class dream of one income, providing for a family where you could raise children, own a home, buy a new car every couple of years, take a vacation, and retire with a pension or a decent savings. And my dad worked in a tool and die shop his whole life, and that was his life, right? 50s and 60s and 70s. And so Reagan came into office with the goal of reducing the middle class back down below 50% to bring back social stability to America. You could argue it was the best of intentions. And the first thing he did was attack unions, because unions were the principal thing responsible for the high wages. He went after Patco and destroyed that union. In fact, they put them out of business, the professional air traffic controllers. And then he went after education. You had, at that time, 80% of the cost of tuition was paid for by state and federal government, and only 20% was the tuition you paid. So anybody could go to college. I went to college, and I paid for it by pumping gas in a gas station and washing dishes in Bob's Big Boy in East Lansing. So Reagan reversed that. He cut, he ended the University of California's free system, and he cut his first year, he cut federal education spending by 18%. And so basically Reagan, and then Reagan promulgated this neoliberal idea of free trade, where he said, companies should be free to seek the cheapest labor anywhere in the world. And that led to the loss of 50,000 American factories and 20 million, mostly unionized manufacturing jobs.
Wow.
So now the American middle class is between 43 and 45% of us. Reagan was very successful. And people know this. People get it. They don't know these numbers. They don't know this history. But they intuit it. And it's created this huge anger, particularly among the former white middle class, who feel, they're like, we know this got ripped away from us. We just don't know who took it. And then along comes Trump and goes, oh, it's those people from Mexico, or it's those people from Haiti, and suddenly you've got this rage. So, looking at this and understanding this historical perspective, I felt, in answer to your question, I'm sorry, you asked me what time it is, and I'm telling you how to build a watch.
No, it's great.
But in answer to your question, why did I write this book at this time? I felt that it was really important that people understand how we got here. and how we can get back to where we were in 1981 as the middle class was growing and America was prosperous.
So let's dig into that a little bit more because I'm first of all define for us exactly what the middle class is. I think we've kind of lost a clear definition of it, but also what are those steps to get back? Because what you kind of laid out there is kind of eye opening because it's the talking point of every election is the middle class, but there's very little done, in my opinion, to build that back up again.
You're right. You're right. And an awful lot of the talk about the middle class is disingenuous. At the same time, politicians are taking money from big corporations, to union bust and refuse to let Medicare negotiate drug prices and stuff like that. They're out there talking about, I'm for the little guy. It's BS. My definition of the middle class is pretty straightforward. It's the life my dad had. It's the ability to raise a family with one income and live a decent life. Now we were not even the middle class. We lived in the lower middle class. We lived in the south part of Lansing, Michigan. My dad bought the house in 1956 for $13,000. When he died in 2006, it sold for $90,000. So it was way below the norm for America. The average house price in America right now is over $400,000. It's a little 3-bedroom house, and there were 6 of us. Me and 3 brothers and my dad and mom. But we did just fine. I never knew that we were, quote, poor. I mean, we weren't really poor, but I never knew that, I never felt deprived. It was a wonderful life. So, from that on the kind of low end to, people living on the salary of say a teacher and a cop, combined income of $120,000, $130,000 a year. That spectrum, from $30,000, $40,000 a year up to that. That's what I would define as the middle class. Now, you ask 30 people, you get 30 different answers, but I think that's a pretty reasonable definition.
I am curious, when you talk about that, and I don't understand the philosophy that the middle class destroys society because what you're describing is ability to have one income and a stabilized family. It seems to me that would bring not chaos, but bring calm to society, not the
Yeah.
opposite of that's going to destroy society. So what you're describing is what we're missing in society, why our neighborhoods are so broken and dysfunctional because we have 2 income families because they have to work and no one's watching the kids. I grew up, my wife is from Lansing, Michigan, so I kind of know
Oh,
the answer. But I grew up with this idea that if you had a stay-at-home mom, and that's kind of philosophy that we kind of live by, it just seems more normal, more natural. The kids have someone to come home to. There's a home life. There's a stability there. But what I see when you have 2 people working and this idea of the kids watching television to grow up with. I mean, I grew up watching MTV generation. So, those videos raised me a little bit. That seemed to destabilize society more than stabilize it.
yeah. Right now it's very fashionable, particularly in Republican circles, to talk about the need for dad at work and mom at home, and I don't want to shame anybody who's a 2 employee family, two people working. I get it that today, right now, to maintain the same standard of living that we had in the 1980s requires 2.2 people working in a household, right? More than 2 incomes. So it's just a reality, and I don't think we should be trash talking people. On the other hand, I don't disagree with you. In fact, I fully agree with you that having a parent home most of the time, or much of the time, or even all of the time, like my mom was, is a good and healthy thing for families, for society. But it's got to be a parent who actually wants to do that. And so I'm not putting value judgments on this outside of the cultural value judgment or the social value judgment. And there, I think lessons of history tell us that it's not a bad thing to have a single working person in a family. It's an ideal thing.
Yeah, and I kind of mean it more, and I agree with you. I kind of mean it more in the sense that you don't have to have the job. If you want the job, that's fine.
Right.
But when you're forced to have 2 people working to survive, it seems like that makes it a little bit less a choice and more of a need, a necessity. And I think that kind of impacts the overall mindset of the family.
Exactly. And a lot of this goes back to this Republican theory that people won't get off their lazy asses unless you kick them, basically. In fact, Rush Limbaugh used to tell this joke. He said, "What do you do to a man when he's down? Yeah, kick him. Otherwise, he won't get up. Wah, 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 wah. Well, if that's true, and they'll go on to say, throwing money at problems doesn't solve things, and giving people, better salaries isn't going to necessarily lift them out of being lazy. Then why is it that we keep throwing money at billionaires? Tax cuts and things like that. I mean, if giving people more money doesn't, I just wanted to point out the illogic of that. But the reality is that there is a certain threshold at which people have a noticeable reduction in anxiety, a noticeable reduction in divorce, in interfamily crises, loss of jobs, all these social ills, even things like teenage pregnancy and whatnot. And that is that middle class area. If you've got that kind of middle class income for your family, then you're pretty much not in crisis. If you have less than that, then you're continually in crisis. And this is, I think, the big divide between Democrats and Republicans is that, Republicans say we should just go with laissez-faire capitalism and the market should pay whatever the market pays, and we shouldn't have unions, and we shouldn't even have a minimum wage. And so what if we've got, 60% of America living in poverty? That's how it was throughout the 1900s and, the 19th century, rather the 1800s, and we did just fine. I would say, no, we didn't do just fine. We had a horrible civil war, among other things. I believe that it's the responsibility of government to set the rules of the game of capitalism so that when businesses play by those rules, it produces and maintains a middle class. And that's, rules I'm talking about are things obviously like, a minimum wage, a decent minimum wage. Right now, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour federally, and in most red states is the equivalent, it hasn't been raised in 16 years, I believe. It's the equivalent of a little over $4 an hour back then. I mean, this is pathetic. And then for servers and people in the agricultural industry and maids and whatnot, it's in many states, it's $2.50 as a minimum wage. This is just not right. Yeah.
So you had some ideas of how we get back to building up the middle class. What are some strategies you bring out in your book that would help us get back to the strengthening the middle class?
The good news is that we've done this before. We did it during that period from 1932 to 1981. We had, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 50 years there, roughly, where we built a middle class. We built the largest middle class in the world, and we built it more rapidly than anybody had ever done it. And it worked. And it didn't produce, by the way, the social upheaval of the 60s. The social upheaval of the 60s was all good stuff. These were societies this was our society at these three different levels of making the transition, with women, young people, and minorities into becoming full members of society. I mean, that's what we should all want. Yes, transitions can be messy. They can be even violent. They can certainly be difficult, but, they're good things. They're good things. And so, we need to bring back the middle class. We need to do it using the same tools we did before. We need to go back to a trade policy, an international trade policy that is tariff-based. Donald Trump talks about this. He's right about tariffs. He's wrong about the way he did it. You don't do them stupidly. You don't do them, just slap them on things and start trade wars and piss off other countries. It just, that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is thoughtful, carefully, and out in the open, transparently, with debate with Congress, so that, if you want to put a tariff on something made in China right now and encourage somebody, therefore, to manufacture here in the United States, they have to know before they invest $1 billion in a factory that that tariff's still going to be here in 15 years. And so, it needs to, but we had tariffs from the founding of the Republic. They were averaged between 30 and 40% from the George Washington administration right up to the Reagan administration. And then Reagan started cutting them down, and now our tariffs are around 2%. And the result of that, as I mentioned before, is all these jobs and factories left the country. So number one, we need to change our policies and go back to the George Washington, Alexander Hamilton policy. It was called the American Plan. China adopted it. We abandoned it in the 1980s. And that's when China adopted it. And that's why China went from being a very poor third world country to the second richest country in the world in less than 30 years, or less than 40 years, fewer than 40 years. The second thing we need to do is strengthen the social safety net. We need to raise the minimum wage. We need to strengthen Social Security. We need to eliminate the cap on Social Security so that billionaires are paying the same percentage of their income into Social Security that you and I do, that bus drivers do, that average working people do. And that will ensure that the program not only is solvent for the next 70 years, but it'll allow it to give about a 20% raise to everybody. In 1980, you could actually retire on Social Security. Reagan changed the formula for inflation, and what's been happening as a result of that is that inflation has been going like this, and Social Security COLAs have been going like this. They've only been going up gradually. And so we need to change the formula for Social Security cost of living adjustments and give everybody a raise. And we could do that if billionaires simply paid into Social Security like the rest of us. We need to strengthen the right to unionize. The Supreme Court has 7 different times made decisions that gutted or cut into the right of employees to unionize. And then you had the 1947 Taft-Hartley law, what Harry Truman referred to as the vicious Taft-Hartley law, that allows individual states to opt out of the Wagner Act, opt out of the National Labor Relations Act, so that people can go to work for a factory that has a union, but they don't have to pay union dues. But the union is forced by law to defend them, to negotiate on their behalf, to hire lawyers for them, to do anything that they want. And this has been used, this so-called right to work for less, which is now the law in pretty much every Republican-controlled state in the Union, and 3 or 4 democratically controlled states that were once Republican-controlled. This has just really damaged the ability of working class people to bring themselves up collectively with a union. Unions are democracy in the workplace. They need to be thought of as such, because that's literally what they are. Unions are democratic institutions. Everything's done by a vote. And the workplaces are not democracies, they're kingdoms, where the CEO is the king, and and then he's got this, the retainers, the lords and the princes under him, and then all the serfs below that. And so bringing democracy into the workplace is a good and healthy thing. And then I would argue that there are a couple of other things that every other advanced democracy in the world regards as a right, and we regard as a privilege. And principal among those 2 things are the right to healthcare and the right to education, right up through, getting your MD or PhD if you're able. And in all these other countries, not only are those things largely free or very inexpensive, but in most of the developed countries in the world, they actually pay you to go to college. And we learned from our experience with the GI Bill, which is how my dad went to college, although he dropped out after 2 years because mom got pregnant with me. But, we sent millions, almost 1 million, I believe, young men, I think it was over 700,000 young men through college with the GI Bill. And what we learned from that was that for every dollar we invested in their college and education, we received $7 over the course of their lifetimes in tax revenue, additional tax revenue we never would have gotten, because they were earning more money as college graduates. So, you invest $1 in college, government invests $1 in college for people, and $7 comes back to government. It's crazy that we're the only developed country in the world that is not doing this. So that's a beginning. I mean, there's a dozen more suggestions, but those are the major points.
I love that. As I think about this and I hear the talk in our government about fighting over these different things, it seems almost, I would say I'm frustrated because we don't seem to be making any progress.
Mm-hmm.
So what can individuals and communities do? Because I don't know if government is going to solve some of our problems, to work toward building the kind of economy that the middle class need.
I think the good news is that Reagan brought neoliberalism to America in 1981. This new economic and governing philosophy that which I've already described, so I won't get redundant here. And Democrats adopted it as well. I mean, Bill Clinton went along with it. Barack Obama went along with it. George W. Bush, of course, Republican. And Donald Trump didn't do anything about it. Although, interestingly, Donald Trump campaigned in 2016 against neoliberalism. And, although he didn't keep any of his promises except for tariffs, and he screwed that up so badly that it created real problems for us, cost us hundreds of billions of dollars. But he didn't govern against neoliberalism without one single exception. But Joe Biden has. President Biden came into office and he said, we're just going to, this Clinton stuff and this Trump stuff and this, Reagan stuff, we're going to reject this. I'm going to go back essentially Joe Biden said, I'm going to go back to supporting unions as hard as I can, to working to raise the minimum wage, to get everybody in this country health care, to reduce the cost of education. He has now 5 times tried different strategies to reduce the student debt load in the United States. Every single time Republicans have sued and taken him to the Supreme Court, and where they rejected his efforts repeatedly. But he's doing everything he can to try to go back to that FDR Keynesian economics system that built the middle class. And he's having some successes. And he has raised a whole bunch of tariffs, including on electric vehicles and motors to make them, and batteries for them, and a whole bunch, and steel and aluminum and a bunch of other things. And so, I think we're moving in the right direction. I just hope we continue moving in that right direction.
Interesting. And how is your research, I'm curious, and your writing on this topic influence your own views of the American dream?
Well, I started the book pretty sure where I was going to end up. There have been a couple of books that I wrote where I was actually shocked and learned things that I just had no idea, like The Hidden History of American Healthcare. There was a German immigrant who came to the United States and in the late 1800s through the early 1900s, and became the vice president of the Prudential Insurance Company. Frederick Hoffman was his name. And he traveled around. He had written a book called Race Traits of the American Negro. And he traveled all around the country preaching that the only thing we had to do to solve the race problem in America was deny medical care to Black people because they were genetically inferior, and that would solve all the problems. And that was the reason why the first Teddy Roosevelt's effort to have single-payer health care insurance was defeated. That was the reason why Franklin Roosevelt's efforts at single-payer healthcare, why Harry Truman's efforts at single-payer healthcare, and Jack Kennedy's efforts at single-payer healthcare were all defeated. Hoffman was the guy that they were quoting when they said we've got to have a 20% hole in Medicare so that low-income people, which was a euphemism in the South for Black people, won't be able to show up at hospitals and doctors' offices that serve white people because they wouldn't be able to afford that 20%, which is why we have to buy Medigap insurance now if you're over 65. I had no idea that kind of explicit racism had played that large a role in why the American healthcare system is as screwed up as it is. My book on guns and my first book in this series, I had no idea that the main reason the Second Amendment was written was to protect the slave patrols in the South. They were the militias, the state militias, and that's why it references militias. It literally was written to protect the slave patrols, and it had nothing to do with the BS you're hearing these days, about self-defense and, we all need AK-47s and whatever. So, some of the books were a real surprise to me as I dug into them. This one was more, I had a pretty good grasp on the data and the information, or at least on the concepts. And what was actually fun was, in some ways, and kind of horrifying in others, was digging out the details so that I could just absolutely back it up. There's 20, 30 pages of footnotes to this book, and everything that I say, I document. And, so people, if they want to quote me or, write something based on what I wrote, they can take it to the bank.
So what do you hope people who pick up this book walk away in terms of a message?
That we've been through a great experiment over these last 40 years, and it was preceded by another great experiment. The first great experiment was Franklin Roosevelt's "Let's have a middle class." Some people thought that wasn't working out, and so we started the second great experiment, the neoliberal Reagan Revolution. That experiment has also come to an end, and it's time for us to find a way to rebuild the middle class, to reinvigorate the middle class in the context of the 2020s rather than the 1950s. And I think we can do it, and I think we're moving in the right direction. But that's I think the main message of the book.
So looking at your back wall, and you showed me all the books you've written so far, what projects are you working on next that we can expect?
Well, I write a daily newsletter over at hartmanreport.com, and that's taking up more and more of my time. My wife, Louise, and I are, this book just is coming out in a couple of weeks, and Louise and I are debating what the next book will be. So we've got some ideas, but right now we haven't made a decision.
See, I was hoping I could break it on the podcast, the next new book that you'll
I don't know.
I'm curious. I like to ask my guests this question. What do you want your legacy to be?
That that America is a more democratic place, that my children and grandchildren grow up in a world that's safer, that's cleaner, that has less climate change crisis, that is more democratic, that's more egalitarian, that is more, seamless, where everybody in our society has a minimum level of rights and privileges and capabilities that frankly, fairness would dictate. That I hope that I've made some small contribution to that.
So where can people find this new New York Times bestseller?
It's any bookstore. Just look for the hidden history of the American dream.
Well, thank you so much, Thom, for taking the time to being on and sharing your heart and your passion for this topic and the American middle class. Because we all know what we strive for, we hope for our kids to achieve. So, thank you for taking the time to kind of unpack the history of this and walking us through what that looks like for us.
My pleasure, Reverend Haney. Thanks so much for having me on your program. It's a pleasure and an honor to share this time with you.
Well, blessings to you.
Thank you. I'll take all I can get.